So, last time we talked about the DaVinci Code and some of the very outlandish theories that it proposes, specifically the very fictional, hypothetical marriage between Jesus of Nazareth and Mary Magdalene. Now, you can go back and watch that video to get an idea of why that's very outlandish and fictional from a historical perspective, okay? Other claims that it makes are about the history of the Gospels. And so that's what I'd like to talk about now. I think the first thing to do is to sort of talk about the Gospels themselves and what we know about them. Because Dan Brown took advantage of the fact that, unfortunately, most Christians don't know a whole lot about the history of the Gospels and about the early Christian church. I think you only really learn about these things if you sort of go to seminary school or if you're a history buff like me. And I didn't become a history buff overnight. I actually, by reading the DaVinci Code, by diving into Ehrman's book, I sort of became passionate about this because I, like many people who read the DaVinci Code, I assumed that all of the historical facts that he was talking about, especially because he says this in a preface, were true, and that there was some wild conspiracy out there to make Jesus look like he was divine when he actually wasn't. Oh my, what a theory. And that there were other gospels out there that talked about him like he was just a man. That's not true at all. And once you start looking into the history of this and you find out what we do know in history, it's all so much more interesting. It's a shame that so many Christians are brought up in the church, and maybe you're a Christian because you were brought to church by your parents and it's just something that you were always taught. But I think many Christians today suffer from the fact that they haven't read the Bible, which you should do if you're a Christian, and you should read it over and over again and again with the notes, because you do need the notes. And I think it's a problem that most Christians are afraid to look into the history of the early church, and they just automatically blindly believe everything that their pastors tell them. And so that when you get a book like the DaVinci Code that makes such absolutely outlandish claims about Christianity, they believe it's true. I mean, this is something that came up with the YouTubers, Rhett and Link from the Good Mythical Morning. They clearly didn't know anything about Christianity when they were Christians, and so it was very easy to shake their faith. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about the Gospels, what we know about them, and why we approved of these Gospels rather than the other Gospels. And then I will talk about the other Gospels that were not approved to be a part of the Bible. That didn't happen at the Council of Nicaea. The DaVinci Code says it happened at the Council of Nicaea, which was organized by Constantine in 325. It was organized by Constantine in 325, but it was a philosophical debate about the Trinity, not about canon. It had to do with a faction of Christianity led by a man called Arius, who believed that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost were three separate entities, and that God was the most powerful, followed by the Son, Jesus Christ. Obviously, that is not what we believe today. We believe that in the three-in-one Trinity, which is a very complex idea. But it's important to note that the Council of Nicaea was not about deciding whether or not Jesus was divine. Not at all. Even Arius, that felt that the Son of God was less important than the Father, certainly believed that he was divine. Okay? There was no question about that. Obviously, spoiler alert, the three-in-one traditional Trinity eventually, after many political struggles, became the doctrine, okay? There was a period that this Arian philosophy about Christianity was very popular, but it fell away, I think, around 400 AD. That stopped being an idea. Just like Gnosticism fell away. It wasn't squelched. It wasn't suppressed. It just naturally fell away because it was not a reasonable, believable part of the Christian faith. So let's talk about the Gospels. Who wrote the Gospels? When did they write them? Okay, so the Gospels, for those of you who are not Christians and don't know what I'm referring to, are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? The rest of the New Testament, you have Acts and then all of the epistles of the different apostles. And the New Testament finishes with the revelations of John. Okay, so who wrote these books? Who were Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Now, before doing a little bit of historical research, I believed that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all disciples, which is not true. Matthew was, traditionally, Christians believe, that Matthew was the disciple. Matthew, the tax collector, okay, who was called Levi, and he left being a tax collector, which was seen as a negative function for most of the first century Jews in Jerusalem, because it represented their oppressors, right? He was working for the Romans, which was very negative. He left that to follow Jesus of Nazareth and become a disciple, okay? We have every reason to believe that Matthew would have known how to read and write. We assume that the other disciples, most of the other disciples, maybe with the exception of Judas who betrayed him and John, most of them probably didn't know how to read and write, but we don't know for sure. But Matthew, there's no reason to believe that he would not have known how to read and write, because if you were working for the Roman government, you would need to know both Greek, which was basically the English of its time. It was the language spoken throughout the world, and Aramaic, which was the language of the local people. Okay, maybe he knew some Latin, we just don't know. But for sure he knew Greek and Aramaic, and he would have had access to paper because he was working for the Roman government. The second gospel is traditionally attributed to Mark. Who is Mark? Not a disciple. He was the interpreter for Peter in Rome, and he wrote down what he heard Peter preaching in Rome. His gospel is the shortest, and most scholars believe it was the first written, but we'll talk about that in a second. Luke, not a disciple. Luke was a physician and one of the assistants to Paul. Now, he's not talked about a whole lot, and this is why a lot of scholars doubt his existence, whether he was the actual author or not. But Luke, okay, also wrote the book of Acts. Okay, so Luke, the author of the Gospel of Luke, also wrote the book of Acts, and that is not in discussion at all. He says at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke that he wrote his gospel based on the other gospels that were already there, probably Matthew and Mark, but we're not sure what he's referring to, and what he heard from Paul and from the disciples that he met, possibly Peter. The last gospel, written in approximately 96 AD, give or take a few years, is the Gospel of John, written supposedly by John the disciple, the youngest disciple of Jesus. In the Gospel of John, he refers to himself as the beloved disciple. This is the reason that many secular historians say, well, it wasn't actually the disciple John, it was this beloved disciple, and we're not sure it was John. We have every reason to believe it was, in fact, the disciple John, because Papias, who was one of the church fathers, one of the second generation, we'll say, who had been taught by the disciple John and possibly by the disciple Andrew. He had been taught directly by the disciples in 125 AD. He wrote, so he was taught by them previously, but in 125 AD, so less than 100 years after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, he wrote that the Gospel of John was written by John, the same author of the Revelation of John, okay? And not only did he write it, but he wrote it when Andrew was still alive to help him with it, okay? So basically, it was the disciple John writing down the text with the assistance of the disciple Andrew. Both of them had known and followed Jesus Christ. So those are the four Gospels and who they are attributed to. Why do we as Christians think they are attributed to these people? Well, the tradition comes from the fathers of the church, like Papias, that I mentioned before, right? He was one of the church fathers in 125 AD, okay? He actually talked about the book of Matthew being attributed to Matthew, and also a document that he called the Logia, which was possibly written in Aramaic. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what this Logia is. And there's a lot of discussion about whether or not Matthew wrote the book of Matthew. In fact, there's a discussion about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John being written by the people they say they're written by. Scholars, just secular scholars, okay, do not agree on who wrote them. A lot of secular scholars will tell you that they were written by unknown authors, and that Matthew, there is a theory that Mark was the first gospel written, okay? And that Mark is classified as document M, which scholars feel was the basis for Matthew and Luke, as well as another document that we don't have, according to scholars, that they call document Quelle, or in German, Quelle, which would be source, right? And in English, we generally call it document Q, right? The Q gospel that we don't have. And a lot of scholars will use this statement about Matthew's Logia, which would be a sayings gospel. It would be a series of different teachings by or attributed to the writing down of the teachings of Jesus Christ. For example, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, and the parables, and the Lord's Prayer, and such. Okay, so people or scholars assume that there was a document that was not a narrative. It was a document of sayings that they call document Q. Q, in this case, for the German word for source. We don't know. Okay, we assume that these Gospels were actually written by the men that they are attributed to, because a lot of the historical church fathers, like Papias that I mentioned before, in 125 AD, we have his writings that attribute the Gospels to these people. We also have the Muratorian fragment from 170 AD. We're missing a page, but on the second page, it refers to, we have half of a sentence, which refers to what we believe is the Gospel of Mark. And then it talks about Luke and John, that Luke was a physician that was an assistant to Paul, and he wrote the Gospel of Luke, and then John was the beloved disciple that wrote the Gospel of John, okay, and that was 170 AD. We have Saint Irenaeus in France that talked about the Gospels being written by these men in 180 AD. We have Tertullian in North Africa talking about this in 200 AD. We have Clement of Alessandria talking about this in 180 AD. So we have tons of testimony from the first 100 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, talking about the fact that these documents were written by specific people. Okay. Scholars tend to be very critical of ascribing these books to these people because they say, well, the disciples wouldn't have known how to read or write, and certainly they would not have known how to write Greek. Because, of course, all the Gospels, the fragments of the Gospels that we have, and we have a bunch of fragments. We have a bunch of fragments from very close to the first period after the death of Christ. We have those fragments in the Nag Hammadi. We have those fragments. There are like 5,000 different fragments that we have that we can date back to like 100, 200, and 300 AD. So again, scholars are, I think, overly skeptical because just like Christian scholars will allow their Christian bias to guide them into saying, no, this is true, this is what happened, and that can certainly be a handicap, okay, which is what I'm trying to avoid here. I believe that secular atheist scholars do the same thing. They just don't want to accept anything that might imply that Christianity is true, or at least that it can be, the Gospels themselves can be attributed to the men that we think wrote them. And to give you an example of why I think this is a bias, Plato, for example, okay, we have works like Plato's Republic. But the only actual copies that we have, complete copies, only come to us from the Byzantine era of around the 800s, okay? 800 / 900 Common Era, or AD, depending on how you like to use dates. And we have fragments of other documents, again, from Nag Hammadi. But if you consider that the fragments, and they are just fragments of papyrus and other things that were found in the Middle East, those fragments are dated to the same period as the first Gospels, in about 100 AD. Okay, they were actually found together. The Nag Hammadi, they have a copy of Plato in the Nag Hammadi documents. And you have to consider that that would have been almost 400 years after the death of Plato. We don't know anything about Socrates that didn't come to us from Plato, but there's no one that would tell you that Socrates didn't exist. Maybe some of you Christians out there don't realize, but there's a large group of skeptics that will try to say that Jesus didn't even exist, which is, I mean, it's less than 1% of all historians would agree with that. 99.99999% of historians believe that Jesus of Nazareth, existed. Of course, they don't believe he was the Messiah, but they do believe he existed. Again, there seems to be a bias within the academic community when it comes to dealing with the Christian Gospels and the Bible in general, okay, even the Old Testament, that is not applied to other pieces of literature, okay? Again, to say that Plato didn't really write Plato's Republic because it's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, people would say, well, that's not true. We know Plato wrote it. We know Plato wrote it because we've got all these other people that say he wrote it. Okay, but they're all people from periods after he died. We don't have testimony from him to look over and say we could use the same metric with talking about many historical figures. You could use the same metric for talking about Homer. We don't, in fact, there are some scholars that will debate about whether Homer wrote Homer or not, or whether it's just a Homeric tradition. But most teachers, when they teach you Homer, they will teach you that Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Again, I could go on and on about this, but I'm already at almost 20 minutes. So I'm going to stop right now. Thank you so much for listening. And maybe I'll dive a little bit more into this in another video. And I'm certainly going to look at the other Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of the Hebrews, and others. But with that, God bless you all. Have a great week.